Welcome. Thank you for attending the IT Service Request Process Development Workshop Summary Outbrief. My name is Dan Vogel. With me is Bob Johnson. We are part of the Service Integration Management team here within the Office of the OCIO. And what we're doing today is we're going to give you an outbrief of one of the process development workshops that we recently did. So what was the mission of the workshop? Well, you know I3P is going on, and we've identified that ITIL version 3 will be the foundational process architecture that each of the service providers is required to adhere to. So as part of that, NASA needed to sit down and come to agreement agency-wide on what IT service request management means to NASA. So what we did was we enlisted the help of each of the centers. We had a team of about 18 to 20 people pulled together to basically go over, here's how we do it today, and here's how we need to do it in the future. So among the scope, what we did was we looked at the comprehensive process development. We looked at, again, analyzing how we do it today, but most importantly, how we need to do it in the future. We recognized that the process really begins with the identification of a user need, and then it ends with the closure of a ticket by the Enterprise Service Desk. A couple of the objectives, I mentioned agency-wide. So we recognize that each of the centers does service request management today, and they probably do a very good job of it. But agency-wide, we need to come to agreement on all the little nuances and incorporations that have to be there for it to work successfully across the environment. So among the other things we looked at were some of the tasks, looking at how a request is made, the authorization of those requests, some of the handoffs to Tier 2, 3 support for fulfillment, updating the customer, and then closure of the ticket. We also looked at some of the key roles and responsibilities, some of the core performance measures, and also some of the risks associated with the process. Ultimately, this was a week-long session, really a 4-day session, late Monday to early Friday. So there were only so many levels of detail that we could get down into, and we identified a list of actions in the form of an action plan, where we identified things that needed to be done, people that needed to do it, and then also dates that they needed to be done by.
So as any good workshop, you need principles to work by before you begin. And our first approach certainly is customer focus. As Dan said, our absolute theme here is agency-wide versus secular versus service-wide versus anything that's in the missions or centers today. So customer focus from an agency standpoint. From a framework standpoint, we selected strategically the ITIL v3 framework. All tickets, all requests must be logged. There should be a single point of contact, and that's the ESD, to make any kind of IT service request. Performance will be measured and reported. Think like a customer, again, part of the customer focus. Keep this process simple. There's a lot of complexity today within some of the processes that we did see from a current state standpoint. And then keep the customer informed of where their request is. The definitions, Enterprise Service Request is the process responsible for managing all IT service requests. That's our vision. Obviously, this is going to happen in stages. But the first one would be the I3P, and then that would phase into applicable center and mission request based on IT services. Again, we tried to follow the ITv3 request fulfillment process. The term service request is used here as a generic description for many types of demands. Now, again, a service request could also be a question. We did realize that, but for the most part, it's going to be for services or for hardware, software types of a request. Many of these are low risk, some are not. Again, an example would be a change for a password, pretty low risk, pretty simple to do, but asking for something more complex, a complex service, would need more authorization, more complexity, and maybe take more time. So there's different levels of service request. And the Enterprise Service Request System is a term that NASA is using for the system or the tool, in this case Remedy 7.5, which is initiating, managing, and fulfilling, ultimately at the end, the service request.
So I mentioned earlier that the centers are doing this today, but they're doing it from a center perspective, and we need to do it from an agency perspective. So as a team, we got together. You see a picture of this here on the screen, and we identified some of the core areas, the major tasks, and then the different groups that get involved in doing this process. Once that was done, we gave each of the participants circular stickers, green for does a task have a value added form change in form, fit, and function associated with it. Yellow stickers were, not really hot on that. It doesn't really add value to the process, but ultimately we still have to do it. It's a requirement within the what we do. And then also red stickers, which would identify some of the waste areas, and mark that up, identified some of the core issues, and then figured out what should we do with it. Now, as part of that, we always have whiteboards going. We always have flip charts going. And what we had was, I think it was about 32 different areas which were issues associated with the current way we did things. But we had the top 5. And we had an issue where end users or requesters really have to know a large amount of data in order for their request to be fulfilled. Not many people know the JAC number. Not many people know some of the other information associated with the model of equipment that they use. So we wanted to make sure that that was not levied on as a responsibility of the person making the request. There weren't a lot of status updates. So once people made a request, they often were left hanging for a little while, and sometimes it could have been, a week or longer before they actually heard back that, we fixed that, or we did that for you. It'll be delivered on such and such a date. So I think the UPS came up a lot as a model there that we wanted to leverage. There were different services available at different centers. So we discussed the opportunity to have an enterprise service catalog incorporated into this process, so a customer could go in, click the listing of stuff that's potentially available to them, and that way we've got a uniform environment. There weren't a lot of pre-approvals regarding things like new hires, et cetera, or I should say it wasn't consistent. I think there are a lot of approvals going on within the environment. We're actually doing a Kaizen next week involving some of the I3P work that's going on and looking at I3P funding in relation to this process as well. So we're looking for consistency, not necessarily is everybody doing it individually. And then ultimately we also had multiple systems and databases for enterprise service requests at NASA. So again, if you're looking at consistency across the environment, it just wasn't there currently.
So we used a Lean Six Sigma approach, if you will, and for this workshop along with ITIL, and we used some of the tools out of Lean Six Sigma. In this particular case, we used the Ishikawa chart, which looks at the causes and whys for the top 5 issues that were identified, and that flowed directly into the source of variation matrix, which looked at the mitigation for each of those issues. Also, building up to the 2B future state, another Six Sigma tool was the PIC chart, and that we took the brainstorming ideas from the team. We had them put stickers up on this particular quadrant, and that's the PIC chart. You can see it's got 4 quadrants: to implement, challenge, kill, and possible, all based on benefits and implementation capabilities within NASA. So we had a lot of great ideas, again, leading from both the waste areas and the brainstorming to be areas to come up with a future state process. Any process has to have key critical success factors to assure its implementation and to make sure that it was properly implemented and executed. And these are the ones we came up with, again, in the pre-future state. There should be a point of contact ordering on behalf of a user and location. When it comes to a lot of these services that will be ordered, we realize within NASA, we're not going to try to change what takes place today, and that is a point of contact type of scenario. Multiple item SR is kind of a parent-child relationship, and obviously a good example would be new hires, where the new hire would branch off into different areas within NASA to have services and products available to them the first day of their hire on their desk for a computer, telephone, etc. Multiple recipient SRs, the ability to edit an SR, non-user assigned items such as conference rooms, minimal open fields. Certainly wanted to make this as simple as possible, this ordering technique. Dan alluded to what they do with UPS today from a notification standpoint, and part of our view here too in our vision was the Amazon approach. And then interfacing with other systems. There's lots of databases that this particular process has to interface with to be successful.
So the team got together and we said, okay, well, what are some of the core things that have to be in the process? We looked at the as-is processes and identified some of the strengths and weaknesses within those, and we came up with the larger to-be process. So on the next couple of slides, that's what we'll be reviewing here. Across the top, you've got some of the major areas, things like request, authorization, fulfillment. And down the left-hand side, you've got some of the major swim lanes, which identify, who's accountable or who's going to be participating in this process. You'll see in the very beginning, the requester, of course, the service desk, really only from were they able to get it in perspective, and then also the approver to get all the routings and authorizations associated with those items done correctly. So let me walk you through what happens. Well, the user recognizes they have a need. So they're going to go into the service request system, and they're going to hopefully enter a ticket themselves, and then it's good to go. It goes on to approval. If by any chance they're unable to do that, they can't figure it out, or they're having difficulty with the system for whatever reason, they can contact the ESD, and the enterprise service desk will say, okay, let me walk you through building this ticket. So rather than saying, yeah, we'll do it for you, they're always in a training mode, because ultimately we want the user or the requester to fill out these tickets themselves. Once it goes to the approval, what's going to happen is, and there are different groups that do this today, so I know we have RAs and we've got other components or other individuals, managers, for example, that participate. For each thing being requested, each service being requested, there's going to be associated with it a functional routing, as in who actually needs to participate to get this thing done, and then also a hierarchical routing, in other words, a management routing for things like approvals. So each service will have these things already predefined, and it's really just a question of where it gets routed to, or where it's been determined to be routed to. You'll see that there's the approval process will take place. Are additional approvals required? If not, it all gets approved. The customer receives confirmation that yes, you're good to go, and then it's going to go on to the next page to that Tier 2-3 service provider group for fulfillment. If it doesn't get authorized, there's no budget left, for example, or your manager doesn't think you need a 42-inch computer screen, that request can either be updated, sent to the customer for update, or it could just be flat out rejected. Different ways of doing this within the environment, and we're still working on getting that done. On the second slide here, you'll see fulfillment and closure processes. So in that lower Tier 2-3 service provider space, there's a kind of darkened box, red outline, and that's where we recognize there's certain things that a service provider is going to do. We also recognize that NASA cannot dictate how that service provider will do those things. We've said, as part of the I3P contract, you have to adhere to ITIL. You have to integrate with ITIL. You have to integrate with the ESD's enterprise service request system so that there is consistency and that NASA ultimately owns the source of record here. So we've identified that things will occur. We've put essentially placeholders in here so we can identify the inputs and outputs. But what will happen is there will be some kind of coordination required. They'll receive that service request from the system. If they need additional information, they can route that request back and forth to get it. Hopefully, the service request is fulfilled, and then they can close that ticket or set that ticket to pending closure. Excuse me. So the service desk can then pick it up and confirm with the customer. The reason that a Tier 2, 3 service provider won't be authorized to close the ticket is that we need some kind of validation that our customers, the NASA employee, was satisfied with what happened. So ultimately, the service provider can set the ticket to pending closure, but it will be the ESD who will then notify the customer and gain concurrence from the customer to close that ticket. If the customer doesn't concur, there is an escalation process associated with that. So depending on the type of request, depending on the timing and the service levels associated with them, depending on the configuration items that these things may touch, they'll get different types of routings. So again, the hierarchical routing could be it goes up a management chain for support, or it's really not that bad. It can go to another Tier 2, 3 service provider for support. Once it gets closed, then that information gets housed, and we fire off a customer survey process. And then we also take all the information on an ongoing basis, and we look for opportunities to improve the process, and that's called continual service improvement. Now, in relation to all these tasks, we need to identify who is accountable or who participates in what. So what you see on this slide is referred to as a racing model. And across the top, you'll see all the tasks that we identified on the previous charts. Down the left-hand side, you'll see a lot of the key participants in the process. And in the matrix portion of the graphic here, you'll see things identified as A for accountable. That individual or that group ultimately owns that task. You'll see R for that group participates in that process. You'll see C for they're consulted with regard to that task, and you'll also see I for they're informed with regard to that task. In the middle, you see kind of a mustard-colored band under I3P coordination. That's still to be determined. There's a lot of opportunity for some of the more complex requests, things like onboarding of a user, or getting a laptop, for example, or getting security, where there are multiple hands involved in the process, multiple service providers potentially involved in the process. So there has to be some kind of coordination effort. That could be a NASA role, could be fulfilled by the ESD, that could be more of a management role, or more of a center point of contact role. We just don't know at this point, so we need to determine that.
Some of the key performance indicators, which are really important, we identified the top ones, if you will. Again, these are performance measurements that are key to the success of any new process, and absolutely key to make sure that the process is being adhered to and is the proper process. Some of the ones we looked at was number of service requests closed without customer approval, some number of service requests that were reopened for whatever reason. A lot of these are based on a certain maturity level within the implementation of this process, but you do need a baseline to start with, and we thought these were some of the key service request KPIs that we needed. Another one that's important too is the number of service requests that were rejected. In other words, we probably, from a CTI standpoint, from a workflow standpoint, the escalation process that Dan walked through was not done for some reason. It did not go to the proper group. It did not go to the proper approvers or fulfillment groups. So pretty key particular KPI to look at for this particular process. But this is ongoing, as you'll see in the activities. This is, again, some that we consider were key, and absolutely successful processes need good performance measurements. From a risk standpoint, one of the objectives we had were to identify the risk for this new process. We did do that. They were identified because of the procurement environment that we're in. We cannot show these to you here. They are available for viewing. They do have owners. They do have dates, and they are being actively worked. From an implementation standpoint, one of the objectives Dan talked about were activity plans. These are the activity plans that we arrived at as a team and assigned to team members or outside members to work. Similar to the incident management process, the categorization and the CTIs and the performance measures are actively being worked. The CTI is really important that the proper coding gets input into the machine that is being owned by ESD. They are working that now with their implementation team. Performance measurements are ongoing. Again, we only identified the top performance measurements that we as a team thought were key. The SIL responsibilities and roles were identified. They have been assigned. There should be a center integration lead assigned to every center. The financial approvals is being owned right now by Omar de Frias, and he is working that, as Dan said, in an upcoming Kaizen event that's going to take place in December to look at the I3P funding based on the approvals for this particular process. And then the documentation, you saw that. Dan showed you that detailed workflow at the level that we arrived at for the 2B process.
So on our last slide, you see a good-looking group of people in the upper right there. We were fortunate enough to have not only strong participation from each of the centers, but we also had consistent participation in each of the 5 workshops that we did. So although this was the second workshop, we had incident management, service requests, which is what we just went through, change management, problem management, and configuration management. So we had about 95% participation from the same people in each of those sessions. So at the first time they came in, it was, oh, well, how do you do this? You know, what is a Kaizen event, or what is a process development workshop? How do we build a process? The second time it was, yeah, I get it. You know, let's get to building it. The third time it was, well, we did these processes already, you know, some other processes. How do we thread these together? By the end of the 5 workshops, everybody was thinking, all right, let's do a full integration workshop where everything threads together, which is really quite impressive for a team to be able to do that. So the way we used to do it, we had multiple service request systems, very specific to the centers, very specific sets of services at the centers, and then no real standardization across, so we had multiple different processes. Going forward, what we're planning is a single enterprise service request process, consistent enterprise service request roles, common performance measures, and then ultimately an agency-wide vehicle for ensuring that we can fulfill enterprise service requests. In doing that, Bob mentioned the action plan. That's going to be key. We've identified almost completed that action plan, and you know, going forward, if we need to detail things out further, we will. So we look forward to working with you all further on this. We always offer to anybody, if you have a specific team that needs this session tailored to them from a technical perspective or from a location perspective, we're happy to do that and really give you a presentation which is more specific to your environment. But feel free to give us a call at any time if you have questions or comments, and we'll be happy to field those for you. Thanks very much.
Thank you. So,
Are you there, James?
right here.
Yeah, I know.
What should we do?
I told you.
I mean, it's all fuzzy. I don't know why it was fuzzy.
Hey, James?